So I just finished reading Marguerite Duras's The Lover, and initially I actually didn't intend on finishing the whole thing. Originally I was only going to read I was going to do like a 20-page taster, and then I realized the book was only 100 pages, and so I decided I'd just finish the whole thing in a sitting. And so, it's a really interesting book, and it covers sort of the conflicts between, colonialism, the nouveau riche, in sort of, in a changing Vietnam, and it sort of shows the sort of changing face of Vietnam, or I think it's Indochina, as it is put in the thing, and how it sort of goes from this sort of old French ancien regime to this sort of new kind of um, you know like again this nouveau riche kind of these new Chinese immigrants who come into Vietnam, and the conflict between that's shown between this love and this relationship between these two unnamed main characters, which makes when I was writing up sort of some of the points for this video, which made it really difficult for me to figure out how to say things, because there's basically no names in the whole book. So for this one, I'll just be calling them the characters. So the main character is Marguerite. I'll just call her Marguerite. And I know it's sometimes not a good thing to sort of mix um like a character with the author. It's bad to misconstrue the two, because obviously there's a definite separation between the author and the character, even though there might be similarities. But there are a striking amount of similarities in the book, and I honestly can't think of a better name than Marguerite. So that's just how it is. So the Lover, it's some sort of semi-autobiographical novel by Marguerite Duras about growing up in Indochina, and it mainly concerns itself with her love that she keeps hidden, sort of with this Chinese lover from the north, who is also left unnamed. He's also from Fushun, which is like where my family's from. So that's a big Fushun mention. That gets a thumbs up. And so the main character grows up in this dysfunctional family with two brothers and her mother. So her mother is this just cold, despairing, sort of like the despair that she has sort of hangs over the rest of the family like a curse. And she clearly struggles with what I think most people would now categorize as like maybe some form of like manic depression, or just some sort of very strong mental illness, because she neglects her children basically, and she while she tries to be there, she also is just she does things that probably aren't very good for her children. And so while her mother is the headmistress of the school in Vietnam, this French school in Vietnam, and they have a helper boy and these servants, they still live in poverty. They mention eating whatever they have to do, like garbage to survive. But it's funny because the family has helping boys who do the work, and they have this maid servant called Bo, who helps them to sew dresses, embroiders the clothes, and they help clean their large European house, which sort of sits on this hill overlooking the Mekong River from this risen place, like sort of above everyone else. And it's a really physical kind of way of showing kind of the establishment of French colonialism in Vietnam, where it's entrenched in the landscape. So like while they have this big house, this big nice grand house, they live in poverty, apparent poverty. And it sticks out compared to these sort of like with their villa and this this patch of thatched sort of these local Vietnamese houses. And so and same with the clothes that Marguerite wears. They're either made by Doe, or they just bought on heavy discount because her mother doesn't have the money. But despite this, there's this colonial dynamic which plagues the family. Family, being French and white, which is particularly visible in Vietnamese society. However, this poverty that they have also means that they are incapable of using the power of the colonial rule. Like even though they are sort of higher up, they're superior by a sort of in their sort of hierarchy system that they've created through the colonial rule. They live in this dual existence of being the superior race, but also being inferior because they of their lack of money. And so this sort of crestfallen status of the French family is contrasted to that of the Chinese man who Marguerite falls in love with. He represents the new money in Vietnam compared to the old colonial ancien regime, which Marguerite benefits from and which slowly crumbles away. It's shown in how the legacy of, France remains with these French lycées, um, but also the fact that the inhabitants of these schools are basically all mixed. Marguerite is one of the only sort of fully white French people at the school. The rest are sort of deemed, half castes who represent how, the French regime has sort of left its mark in the country. But again, the fact that it's sort of lost its, power, unlike, other colonies, like particularly, you think of like places like you think like British colonies, where um sort of the people have been left there, untouched. They continue residing there. The French people in Vietnam at this point are basically all gone, and all that remains are sort of the traces of themselves that they leave through the legacies of the children that they bear. And the only other French person, fully French person who was there is this girl Helen Laganelle, who um it's this really weird relationship that Marguerite has with her. She sort of fetishizes her as this sort of almost kind of sexual kind of entity, and it's really weird. And she sort of it's hard to say what she represents. She's certainly not like a model French sort of colonial sort of citizen. Like she's far from it. She's this kind of emotional, kind of whiny, annoying this girl who just doesn't really care or know about anything. And so perhaps it represents sort of how sort of the French colonial rule sort of twists itself, and so it's far from sort of that great sort of image that colonial France sort of projects of itself during this time. And instead at this point it's this dilapidated sort of shell of itself. And so in comparison to this dilapidated colonial rule, Duras shows the flourishing state of the Chinese enterprise in Vietnam, specifically in the district of Cholon, a large quarter of Ho Chi Minh City that's basically filled with Chinese people. And I looked on Google and it said it's considered one of the largest, probably the largest Chinatown on Earth by area. So but in this place, so basically, it's flourishing economically. The buildings rising up everywhere. It's bustling, and all these people are extremely wealthy. Especially this is characterized by the Chinese man from the north. Because every day after school, Marguerite is picked up by this Chinese man in his black limousine and driven to Cholon, where the two make love in his apartment that's been developed by his father in the area. They first meet one day when he sees her standing outside, dressed in her sort of men's sun hat with this like lace and her golden shoes and white dress. Which Marguerite also describes as being sort of dressed as a child prostitute, which is like really weird. And they talk, and it's weird, and he sort of shows an attraction for her, and she doesn't really, is not really attracted to him, but she sort of does it as a way of escaping from her mother and her family, and sort of an assertion of her own agency to her mother and her brothers by saying that they won't know where she is when she's with them. She'll be completely on her own, with them having not the vaguest clue where she is, and so that's a sort of resistance against sort of what they've imposed on her. And so she goes with him, and she goes with him into Cholon to the bustling streets and the multi-story restaurants, where she describes, the Chinese man as yelling and talking loudly in the restaurant, something she sees as, a fixture of the language, and something which is sort of depicted as sort of beneath her. Like, even though, again, these old French villas are, dilapidated. They're growing old and they're growing you know, and all these new Chinese settlements all springing up everywhere, and springing up at really, the really successful places. She still sees them as inherently inferior. She goes in the building and she's like, oh, these Chinese people are so loud. They speak such a weird language. Their restaurants are so weird. And there's a part where they pass the Chinese part and they go on to a higher floor where there's a French restaurant where she feels much more comfortable, because it's quiet and it has the fixtures of like sort of a French sort of European fine dining experience. Although there's far less people and it's this feeling that it's a far more quite uh, sort of bad kind of experience compared to this flourishing, this great new sort of Chinese kind of thing that's going on. And it is really this quintessential story about the dynamics between old money and the nouveau riche, and how like that is sort of penetrates to every part of life. The two make love, and they have constant rendezvous where she gets picked up, which becomes a staple that's acknowledged by the school and Marguerite's classmates. However, during when Marguerite makes love to this man, he's completely desexed. He's this sort of sexless kind of you know sort of sickly figure. Marguerite sees him as this sort of unathletic, kind of unattractive looking man. He's not conventionally attractive in any way, but she likes him, or at least she thinks she does, for his wealth at this point. And so eventually Marguerite decides to introduce this man to her family, and they entirely ignore him at the dinner table. Even though he picks up the entire bill, he pays for everything, and they know that he's been picking up Marguerite, he's been paying for her, blah 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 blah. They completely ignore him. They pretend he does not exist. They talk to one another, and and she mentions that the only time her mother acknowledges him is when he picks up the bill and she sees, oh wow, it's a lot of money. That's about it. Apart from that, there's nothing. And so this denial and foreboding of the Chinese man is what eventually leads to Marguerite having to leave, as and the two cannot sort of be together anymore. And the Chinese man is told by his father to marry a Chinese girl, sort of, I guess, in a sense within his caste, and within it's not to think about that white the white girl, because to them the idea that they would be together is just so entirely unfathomable, because not because mainly because of the race, but more because of, again, that colonial structure. um the French are in this sort of higher, sort of untouchable position where they're above everyone, and they show that everyone else is below them, which makes it so impossible. And it's weird. And then at the end, Marguerite wonders if the Chinese man thinks about her when making love to his wife, and how like he summons this image of her, uh to like to make love to her. And at the end, he eventually he reaches France, where he tells Marguerite that he wants to hear the sound of her voice, which is a declaration of his resigning love. And so the two, they're star-crossed lovers because they're cast in a race, both in Vietnam and both at the same time. They cannot be together, partly because of a 12-year age gap and the fact that she's underage at the start of this, which is really wrong. Also because of their race and the colonial prejudices which remain in this sort of tectonically shifting Vietnam. And so, the book it's a very good book, and I would highly recommend it to anyone who's sort of interested in maybe looking into sort of colonial kind of literature, because it offers this very honest kind of look into a very specific place and time when France is France's empire is collapsing, and its influence is kind of waning, while this new kind of you know sort of new Vietnam kind of arises from the ashes of this French Empire, with the Vietnamese people themselves. And it covers the book also intersperses this love story with instances of flashing forward, where Marguerite thinks of her brother who dies. um it's either between Japanese colonialism in the Japanese colonial period or during the Vietnam War. But in this time again, it's this feeling of displacement for the colonial ruling class. This strong feeling of displacement by the native peoples and these new sort of exogenous kind of others in the Chinese. And so it's an incredibly interesting story. And I think if you're interested in that kind of thing, give it a read. But yeah, that's basically all I have to say about it. Yeah, I mean, thank you for watching if you got this far.